Welcome to the Social Workers Radio Talk Show. I'm your co-host, Alyssa Lotmore, and today we have a special pre-recorded segment. Ryan Johnson, who is a master social worker, is employed with the New York State Kinship Navigator. He recently presented at UAlbany on the topic of kinship care. Most students know little to nothing about kinship care, and his presentation, along with this interview, serves as a great introduction to those unfamiliar with this portion of the child welfare population. Many professionals are familiar with the concept of kinship care, but are unaware of the services and research surrounding kinship care. So this interview will be beneficial to those interested in finding out how to assist individuals in accessing services and maintaining permanency. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ryan Johnson.
Hi, how are you?
And I want to jump right in, because a lot of people don't really know what kinship care is. So can you start off with a brief explanation of what is kinship care?
Absolutely. So kinship care is anytime a non-parent, that could be a grandparent, another blood relative, or even fictive kin. And fictive kin would be somebody who's like a godparent or a very close neighbor who provide full-time care and control of children in their homes, meaning they're taking care of a relative's children.
So what would cause a situation like that to happen?
Sure. So children enter kinship care for the same reasons that they enter foster care. The parents are unable or unwilling to care for their children. So nationwide, we're looking at about 2.7 million households are kinship care households where a relative or fictive kin are the primary caregivers of a child who's not their own in their household. And that number is about 230,000 in New York State. The reasons that children enter kinship care might be because their parents are using substances, they could be mentally diagnosed, they may have died, abuse and neglect proceedings, but also military deployment. A lot of people don't realize that when military are deployed, what happens to those children? A lot of times they go and stay with a relative.
And are there different kinds of kinship care, or is it just, kinship care is kinship care?
So there are a couple different kinds of kinship care. In New York State, we refer to the two kinds of kinship care as formal and informal. So when we're talking about formal kinship care, that means that this is a relative who has been approved or certified as a foster care parent, meaning that Child Protective Services, or ACS in New York City, has gone in and removed the child from the home because they have founded an allegation against the parents for potentially abuse and neglect or something along those lines. They will take the child and they'll certify a kinship caregiver, a grandparent for instance. They'll certify that grandparent as a foster caregiver. Then they'll place the children with that foster caregiver, who happens to be a relative, and provide foster care supports to that relative. So in New York State, we call that formal kinship care. Informal kinship care would be, there's a couple of different kinds of informal kinship care where sometimes it's, the grandparents notice that the parents are really struggling. Maybe they're homeless, maybe they're dealing with a drug issue, something along those lines, and they offer to step in and take on the child. They've stepped in, they take on the child, they go to court, they get legal custody, legal guardianship. Sometimes it's joint custody, sometimes it's temporary custody. There's a plethora of different options that informal custody could really look like. And so they'll come on and they'll take on this child outside of the child welfare system. And so they may take on legal custody and just continue that into forever. Sometimes there's informal placements where the kinship caregiver has no legal custody. They don't want to go through court. They are just taking care of their relative child. A lot of times this is the case in military deployments. This happens to be the case when people are afraid to go through the court system. They don't want to be identified by child welfare system, not for any reason other than we just don't want to be associated with that. We're just going to take the child. I'm just going to help raise this child. Sometimes that's for a very short amount of time. Other times it's for a very long amount of time. So that's another form of informal kinship care.
Now, what would be the benefit of a formal versus an informal?
Absolutely. So I think that there is a benefit to formal kinship care because when you have entered the foster care system, there are a lot of supports put in place, not only for the caregiver, but for the child. The child is going to receive some extra supports from the child welfare system in the form of financial assistance, in the form of intensive case management. There's going to be people involved in this child's life who are ensuring that the child is in a good permanent placement. So that kind of foster care placement ensures that this child is experiencing or is going to experience some permanency moving forward. It also frees up what's known as KinGAP. That stands for Kinship Guardianship Assistance Program. So a kinship caregiver is only eligible for this program, KinGAP, if they've gone through the foster care system. Now, what I'll explain is, normally in foster care, when a child's removed from their parents, there's a 22-month period for the biological parents to kind of get back on track with their case plan. So otherwise, if they can't prove 15 out of 22 months that they followed their case plan in order to get the children back, the children will be taken away and the parents' rights will be terminated. They call that a TPR, termination of parental rights. So the child will then be available to be adopted. So if the child has been placed with grandma and grandpa in a kinship foster care formal placement, that child is now eligible to be adopted. Okay. So then the kinship caregiver, who's grandma and grandpa and has been grandma and grandpa this whole time, now they're expected to adopt. So sometimes that's a really great option. Potentially, a kinship caregiver is taking care of a child that, their child maybe was a teenager when they had their child. So now we're talking about there's not a huge age gap between their biological child and their grandchild who they're now taking care of. So they're happy to just say, you know what, I'll adopt. This child I'll become mom and dad, to this child, no problem. But KinGAP allows for that grandma and grandpa who have been the foster care parent to maintain their relationship as grandma and grandpa, but also receive an adoption subsidy. So normally in foster care, you are receiving a subsidy from the government to help you pay for the expenses related to this child. If you adopt, that money continues on in the form of an adoption subsidy post-foster care. KinGAP is akin to an adoption subsidy, but you're not changing the legal relationship, nor do you have to terminate parental rights. KinGAP in New York State is not widely used. It's relatively new as of 2008 from federal legislation. So it's still not a widely practiced form here, but honestly, it's a good second alternative for people in foster care. Now, informal care, you asked the question, what's the difference between formal and informal, and why is one better than the other? It's not better than the other. Informal care, there are also supports for informal care. They're just not as intensive as they would be in the foster care system.
When we look at sometimes the situations that children come out of, there's a reason sometimes that they're taken away from the family or the parents, temporarily losing their rights. It seems like there needs to be some supports, and it can be a benefit to go through that formal process where maybe they have a social worker or a case manager or someone who's more involved than in the informal. Is that how?
Absolutely. So in informal care, you have, like I said, a couple of different situations that could have happened. They could have been taken by CPS, so there could have been child welfare involvement, and we'll talk about the process of diversion in just a second. But they could have been taken and then placed with a grandparent that way. There could be this informal arrangement between the kinship caregiver and the biological parent where they've just gone straight to court and signed over legal custody or legal guardianship to the kinship caregiver. Or there could be no legal standing, but the child just is living with grandma and grandpa now, and they're trying to help raise this child. There are still supports available. They're just not as intensive. So financially, there's something called the Non-Parent Caregiver Grant. This is essentially child-only public assistance. It's federal dollars passed down to the states for kinship caregivers that in these situations, they're eligible to receive public assistance on behalf of the children. In the federal legislation, it's called the Non-Parent Grant. throughout New York State, in every county, they call it something different. For instance, in Onondaga County, they call it the OTG grant, other than grantee. In New York City, a lot of times they call it child-only public assistance. Other counties call it the non-parent caregiver grant. And then still yet, others call it the kinship grant. Depends on the county. There's a lot of counties in New York State. They all call it something different, but it's a federally available grant. It averages about $400 a month, and it's available, and it's based on the children's income, not on the parents' income, not on the biological parents or the kinship caregiver's income. So essentially, most children don't have an income. Income could include child support, Social Security, or death benefits. Most children don't have those. About 95% of all kinship children are eligible to receive the non-parent caregiver grant, but only 15% actually get it because they are not aware of it. Local departments of social services don't, push it onto people, and for a plethora of other reasons, they're not receiving it. So there is that money available, help with the financial part of raising a child. And then OCFS, Office of Children and Family Services, has funded 22 programs throughout the state. There's some located at Buffalo, Binghamton, Albany, New York City, Hudson Valley, where a kinship caregiver can go and receive case management services. There are 22 programs, but each of them are funded at about $100,000. So they're very small programs, about a staff and a half, maybe. So their caseloads tend to be fairly small, but they're there, they're in the community, they're able to help kinship caregivers get connected to the resources, like I'm talking about the non-parent caregiver grant and Medicaid, other local resources that a kinship caregiver might need. So think of it this way. Why do these people need case management services? Your grandma and grandpa, Child Protective Services shows up at your door. They knock on your door 10 o'clock at night, and they say, here's your grandkids. Either you take them now, or we're going to take them and put them into foster care because we've removed them from their home. As grandma, and a lot of times it's single grandma. As grandma, you might be living on a fixed income. You might be living in a one-bedroom apartment, but they're your grandkids, so you're absolutely going to take them. So you take the kids, and it's September 14th. The kids are supposed to be in school. Are they going to be able to be transported from my home? Are they going? I don't have beds in my one-bedroom apartment for these 3 grandbabies that I just took on. So what are the supports that are needed? Like, these are the supports that are needed. Yeah. You hook them up with a case manager that's hopefully in their region now. These 22 programs cover 23 counties. So there's 62 counties in New York State. So there's a lot of counties that are not covered. That's where the New York State Kinship Navigator comes in. We provide information and referral to these folks. But, essentially it's that first couple of months that these caregivers really need services to be able to say, where can I get a bed? Where these kids came with the clothes on their back, and that is all. Well,
it's sort of like a shock. Here's kids, you're a parent now again. And there could be an age gap. I mean, you mentioned the example of maybe a parent, the mother was a teenage pregnancy, where the age gap isn't that big. Whereas if it's an older child and maybe the grandparent is in their 60s or 70s, and there's maybe 3, 4, or 5 kids now, ranging from very young ages to 7, 8 years old or something, that could be a lot for an individual, but at the same time you don't want to turn away your family. So must be a lot. Is there emotional resources for parents, like kinship cares, or the supports? I mean, yes, we talked about here are resources to connect you with services, but is there types of counseling services or a support network or support groups for individuals who are going through this huge, here you're a parent at, 65 years old?
Right, absolutely. So almost all, if not all, of the 22 local programs offer what's known as the Relative as Parents program or something akin to that. So the Relative as Parents program is essentially an 8-week curriculum where it's a family support group, A lot of kinship caregivers don't realize that there are thousands and thousands of other families in the state that are just like them. A lot of kinship caregivers think they're alone.
Can I interrupt you for
Absolutely.
a sec? What are some statistics, just so like we can put this into perspective of how, is this a big issue or is this just a few cases?
Absolutely. So we're looking at New York State has about 230,000 families who are kinship caregiving families. Now, when we're talking about that, we're talking kind of in a generalized formal and informal. A bunch of research has been done. Different organizations like Annie E. Casey have come in and tried to analyze how many kinship caregiving families there are. But it's difficult because not every kinship care case, as we mentioned, is recorded in child welfare. Not every kinship case has gone through the courts, and a lot of them are very informal, private, just between the family members. So every kind of number that we throw out there is an estimate because it's impossible to track. Also, the child welfare system doesn't always track when placements go to families. So here's some interesting facts for you. 2015, foster care admissions in New York State. In New York City, there was 3,905 foster care admissions, and in the rest of the state, there was 4,866. New York City does a great job of certifying or approving kin as foster parents. So of those 3,905 foster care admissions in New York City, 1,025 of those cases went to kin. So the kin were certified as foster parents and are receiving foster care services. In the rest of the state, 4,866 admissions, only 351 were certified or approved as foster care, kinship foster caregivers. So what happened to the rest of them? Either the kids go into foster care with somebody they don't know, and a lot of times what happens is, like I mentioned, we were going to talk about diversion. Child welfare has this practice of diversion where they identify a child who needs to be removed from their home. They remove that child, and they find a family member to place that child with. But instead of certifying or approving that family member as a foster caregiver, they place the children as part of a safety plan or as part of a permanency option, where the child is then placed with them, and CPS or the child welfare system essentially washes their hands of the case and says, the child has achieved permanency, so now the case is closed. So we call that diversion because these placements are sometimes called direct placements, they're called 1017 placements, other times they're called en docket. All three of those terms are referring to the same thing. We believe that this process is essentially diversion. They're diverting kids away from the foster care system, away from the support system. So in New York City, ACS pulled a bunch of children. They only placed 149 children in direct placement, 1017 custody with a relative caregiver. Like I mentioned, 1,025 were certified as foster care. In the rest of the state, there were 2,023 direct care placements in the rest of state, where CPS went in, took the child, and placed them directly, and then offered no additional services to the family in the form of foster care. So there's a big kind of issue when it comes to providing services to families. Like I mentioned, only 15% of families actually take advantage of the non-parent caregiver grant because they don't know about it.
So I mean, when you hear that, you're like, oh, that must be great for the rest of the state because they're not going in foster care. These kids aren't in foster care, but when you think about it, now the kinship caregivers are not getting those foster care services. But so in that respect, you'd like to see them as a legal foster care, I guess, guardian in the sense, instead of just this child is staying with a grandparent as part of their safety plan and a permanency plan, because now the services are not there.
Let me throw some other stats at you. In New York State, the New York State Kinship Navigator got a federal grant where we were able to find out a lot more about the kinship population in New York State. Part of our study was finding some of the needs of kinship caregivers. 40% of kinship caregivers in New York State fall below the federal poverty line, meaning that for the family size, they are not making enough money to really support the family because they're on fixed income, maybe Social Security, maybe retirement benefits. And this isn't just, we're not just talking a certain portion of the population of kinship caregivers. Like, it's difficult to take care of young children when you're a retired or unemployed adult. And so if you're just caring for yourself, it's much easier. You take on 3 kids, it's much more difficult. So we're talking 40% of kinship caregivers fall below the federal poverty line, and nationally, 30% of all kinship caregivers fall 200% below the federal poverty line, meaning these people are the poorest of the poor. But the process of diversion is still happening. So they're taking the children, putting them with extremely poor caregivers who live in one-bedroom apartments or who, need some extra financial assistance, and they're not giving them the support of the foster care system to be able to then give them the financial assistance, help them find appropriate housing, so on and so forth. I will mention that not every kinship caregiving case needs to be a foster care case. There are plenty of cases where the caregivers are perfectly capable of taking on the children by themselves. We're talking 70% fall above the federal poverty line nationally, 60% in New York State. So not everybody's struggling financially, but a large portion of kinship caregivers really are. And that has not curbed the practice of diversion, especially in upstate, or the rest of the state, I should say. And so that, like we're talking about here, is one of the reasons why it would be really important for a kinship caregiver to know what their options are when the children are presented to them. Am I eligible to become a foster caregiver? Let me make that decision. But if they're not being given the option, then they don't know.
Well, I mean, it's a practice that, based on your statistics, that is growing, or it's a big number. And it got some attention. I mean, Simone Biles with the Olympics, that was something that kinship care was very present. Her grandparents adopted her, and she was raised with her grandparents, who are considered her parents. And that was the big issue, that was sort of brought up on the news.
Absolutely.
But it brought kinship care to, I guess, made awareness of it, that grandparents can adopt their grandchildren, they can become their parents, and that this is a process. So is sort of media attention, is that helpful to you in your work when you see that, here's a very famous athlete who's well liked by many and went through this process? How does that
Absolutely.
help?
We love media talking about kinship care. Because I can walk into a room when I do a presentation and I can say to a bunch of social workers, who's heard of the term kinship care? And maybe 2/3 of the class will raise their hand, and the other third will be like, I think I've heard of it, maybe, I'm not sure. And so just imagine the general population. If you walk up to a stranger on the street and say, have you heard of foster care? Well, yeah, of course. Well, have you heard of kinship care? No, I have no idea what that is. So any media attention we can get on the topic of kinship care is great. Simone Biles, you mentioned that that's a great example of somebody who was raised in kinship care, raised by her grandparents. There are a lot of people who have been in kinship care or are kinship caregivers that will shock you. President Obama was raised by his grandparents in Hawaii. His parents were married. His father went back to, I believe it was Ethiopia, and his mother went to Indonesia, and Barack chose to stay in Hawaii with his grandparents and was raised by his grandparents for the majority of his educational, younger life. Bill Clinton spent a time being raised by his grandparents. Sandra Day O'Connor spent her elementary school years being raised by her grandmother. Dwayne Wade, point guard for the Miami Heat, now he plays for the Chicago Bulls. He's raising his sister's child, so his nephew, and has for many, many years. These are all people who have deep roots in kinship care, who are nationally known figures. Maya Angelou is another really great example of somebody who's extremely famous and who was raised by her grandmother for a long time. And kinship care is one of those things where it's fluid. So, President Obama, his parents were there in his life for a while, then they left, then they came back, then they left again. So kinship care is fluid like that. Same thing with Maya Angelou. She spent a number of years with her grandmother, and then a number of years with her father, a number of years with her mother, kind of all over. This is very very normal in the world of kinship care. So yeah, we love when people talk about it because it is really prevalent. A lot of really big name people, Simone Biles included, have experienced this. But again, these kinship caregivers oftentimes think that they're the only ones. They don't understand that it is a very widely practiced thing where there are a lot of people who are experiencing the same difficulties, the same challenges. Because like you're saying, a 65-year-old trying to raise a 3-year-old is a very difficult thing. We just had an event on September 8th celebrating September as Kinship Care Month. So in New York State, as well as in 8 other states throughout the country, September is Kinship Care Month, meaning that there was a resolution passed by the Senate, by the Assembly, by the governor. They declared proclamations saying, let's celebrate kinship caregivers. It's a great opportunity for the kinship community to kind of be recognized by the state and to recognize that there are other people in the state who are doing the same thing as them. And so during Kinship Care Month, we had Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins come in. She's the minority leader in the Senate. She came in and told a story. She represents the Westchester area. There's a program in Westchester called the Family Service Society of Yonkers, and so the senator has had a lot of interaction with that group. They were having her there for a visit. She met a 90-year-old grandmother whose grandchild was going into college. She had been taking care of 5 grandchildren, and the oldest was in college, and the youngest was 3, and she was 90. So we're talking huge age gaps here. Mm-hmm. We're talking taking care of grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Maybe in this case it was a great-great-grandchild. I'm not sure, but there is that huge age gap. But to be able to recognize the extremely difficult work that these kinship caregivers are doing, to be able to celebrate them, and then to be able to use this resolution as a tool to be able to then influence policy going forward. How can we decrease diversion practices and or increase the support services available to kinship caregivers? If we're not going to certify them as foster care parents, how can we support them in other venues?
Well, I mean, this has been really informative, and as we wrap up here, I mean, I think you raised awareness about a lot of issues, and I even had an internship, I was telling you before we started, in kinship care when I was a BSW student, and I still didn't even know about all of this, all these practices and resources, and, it's such a big process for anyone to go through, especially as a person who's getting thrown into it. What are my resources? Where am I going? What am I doing? And even as someone who interned, I didn't even know about all of this, the things that are available and constantly changing. So where do people go for resources if they want to find out more, if they're in a situation where they feel that they need to take a family member and raise that child? Where do they go? What do they do? How
Absolutely.
Do they find help?
Well, a great resource is my agency, the New York State Kinship Navigator. You can go on our website. It's www.nysnavigator.org. On our website, we have dozens and dozens of legal fact sheets. So if you want to know more about financial assistance, what you're eligible for, we have legal fact sheets. If you want to know about legal custody and guardianship, how to go about that, we have legal fact sheets. If you want to know about how do I enroll my child in school, how do I make medical decisions for this child, we have fact sheets upon fact sheets, and they're all cited with legal documents, meaning that they can be brought, say, before a judge, and you can say, this is the part of the law that says that this, and this are what I'm eligible for. So that's a great website. We also operate a helpline Monday through Friday that's staffed by a kinship specialist. That helpline is open 10 to 4, and the number is 877-454-6463. And you can talk to a live person, just ask them questions. I've been taking care of this child for 5 years. I've never received any assistance. Am I eligible because I've been taking care of them? Yes, you absolutely are still eligible. We'll walk you through the process. We'll send you the application on how to apply for assistance. We have videos on our website helping you fill out the application for financial assistance. There's a lot of resources available through our agency, the New York State Kinship Navigator, And then we can also make a referral to a local program. If you're calling from Albany, there's a program here in Albany we can refer you to. If you're calling from the Hudson Valley, there's a couple of programs in different counties in the Hudson Valley we can refer you to. New York City, there's a bunch of programs. So the New York State Kinship Navigator website is a great resource for people who are looking for just more information or looking to talk to somebody and looking to get that process started.
Well, thank you so much. Hopefully people are listening and can either use that information for themselves or share it with someone that they know, because I know several individuals who are in that kinship care role. So it is more common than I think people realize it is, or maybe they didn't have a name for it. They just thought this was what, they didn't know it had a name. I just have my grandchild or another relative and I'm raising them. And now they have a name, which means that they can find resources. So thank you. And again, this was Ryan Johnson, who is a master social worker who is employed with the New York State Kinship Navigator program.
Thank you very much.